There are some dogs that everyone notices right away. Their coats shine under the shelter lights. Their tails never stop wagging. Their eyes are bright with the kind of hope that makes people smile and say, "That's the one." And then there are dogs like Max. Max was a senior dog with a graying muzzle and eyes that had seen too many goodbyes. He'd been adopted 3 times, and 3 times he'd been returned. Not because he was difficult, not because he misbehaved, but because he was quiet. Because he was older, because people wanted excitement and Max had only patience to offer. This is the story of a dog who waited in the spaces between hope and silence, a dog who learned that kennels have sounds, the clang of metal bowls, the echo of footsteps that don't stop at your door, the soft hum of fluorescent lights that never quite turn off. He knew the weight of being passed over. He understood what it meant to watch younger dogs leave while he stayed behind, his name still written on the same card week after week. But Max's story doesn't end in waiting. It ends on a porch, in the golden light of late afternoon, with someone who finally understood that the best things aren't always the loudest, that loyalty doesn't need to be proven with energy, that sometimes the heart that's been broken before is the one that knows how to love most deeply. This is a story about time, dignity, and the quiet truth that being needed matters far more than being chosen quickly. If you've ever felt overlooked, if you've ever waited longer than you thought you could, the story might feel familiar, and by the end, it might be like home. Let me tell you about Max, and the day everything changed. The shelter was quietest in the early mornings, before the volunteers arrived and the phones began ringing. That's when Max preferred to be awake. In those still hours, he could hear himself think. He could remember things without interruption. The kennel around him smelled of disinfectant and dog food, a combination that had become more familiar to him than any home he'd ever known. Max was a senior dog, though nobody knew exactly how old. The shelter estimated somewhere between 9 and 11 years. His muzzle had gone completely gray, and his eyes carried the kind of weariness that comes not from a single hard day, but from many long months of the same routine. He was a medium-sized mixed breed, brown and white, with soft ears that folded gently against his head, and a tail that wagged only occasionally now, and only for people he'd known for a while. He had been at the shelter for 6 months this time. Before that, he'd been adopted and returned 3 times in 2 years. The first family said he wasn't energetic enough for their kids. The second said he didn't get along with their other dog, though Max had only been trying to find a quiet corner to sleep. The third family never gave a reason. They'd simply brought him back after 10 days, his bed still in the car, his collar barely worn in. Each return had taken something from him. Not his gentleness, not his patience, but perhaps his expectation that things would be different. Max had learned not to hope too hard. Hope was exhausting when it kept being disappointed. The kennel he lived in now was in the back corner of the shelter, away from the main entrance where people walked by on their way to see the younger dogs. It was a practical spot, the staff had said, because Max didn't do well with too much noise. The truth, though nobody said it out loud, was that senior dogs in back kennels were easier to forget about. Out of sight, out of mind. It wasn't cruelty. It was just the way things worked. Max's daily routine rarely changed. Morning feeding at 7. A short walk in the yard at 9 if a volunteer had time. Afternoon feeding at 3. Another walk at 5, though sometimes that one got skipped if the shelter was busy. Evening settled in with the hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of cars passing on the street outside. He slept lightly, the way animals do when they've learned that nothing is permanent. He watched the other dogs come and go. A puppy arrived one Tuesday, full of clumsy energy and needle-sharp barks, and was adopted by Saturday. A young Labrador mix came in on a Monday and left on a Thursday. Even the older dogs, the ones with a little gray starting to show, found homes faster than Max did. He didn't understand why. He kept himself clean. He never barked unless there was a real reason. He walked well on a leash. He knew how to sit, how to wait, how to be gentle with his mouth when taking treats. But people walked past his kennel with barely a glance. Sometimes they'd stop, read the card attached to the front bars. Max, male, senior, mixed breed, good with adults, and then move on. He'd learned to recognize the exact moment when someone decided he wasn't what they were looking for. It was in the eyes, a subtle shift from curiosity to polite disinterest. He'd see it, and he'd lower himself back down onto his blanket, and the day would continue. The shelter staff were kind. Sarah, the kennel manager, always spoke to him softly when she walked by. Tom, one of the weekend volunteers, would sit outside his kennel sometimes and read aloud from the newspaper, as if Max might enjoy the company. And maybe he did. It was hard to tell anymore what he enjoyed versus what he simply endured. On this particular morning, as pale light began filtering through the high windows, Max lay with his head on his paws and watched the world wake up around him. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. The day was beginning, the same as every day before it. He didn't know yet that this day would be different, that in the coming weeks, something would shift in ways he couldn't predict. But for now, in the quiet before the noise, Max simply waited. Waiting was something he'd gotten very good at. Time moved differently in a place like this. Minutes stretched, days blurred together, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the patience and the weariness, a small part of Max still wondered if someone, someday, might see him not as too old or too quiet, but as exactly enough. The morning light grew stronger, and Max closed his eyes, letting the familiar sounds of the shelter wash over him once more. Max hadn't always been a shelter dog. There'd been a time, years ago, when he'd known what it felt like to belong somewhere, to have a name that was called with affection, not just necessity, to sleep in the same spot every night and wake up knowing where he was. His first family had gotten him as a puppy, from a neighbor whose dog had an unexpected litter. He'd been the quiet one, even then. While his litter mates tumbled over each other and yapped for attention, Max had been content to sit and observe, his small tail wagging gently whenever someone looked his way. The family had chosen him for that calmness, thinking he'd be a perfect fit for their household. And for a while, he was. He'd grown up in a house with a small backyard, a fence that needed mending, and a covered porch where he'd lie in the shade on hot afternoons. There'd been a man who worked long hours but always had time to scratch behind Max's ears when he came home. A woman who hummed while she cooked and saved him scraps from dinner, a routine that felt permanent, the way good things do before they end. But permanence is a story people tell themselves, and Max learned that the hard way. The man got a job in another state. The woman said the new apartment didn't allow dogs. There were phone calls, discussions, and voices that rose and fell with frustration and resignation. Max didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Something was changing, and he wasn't part of the solution. One morning, they loaded him into the car with his bed and his food bowl, and he thought they were going to the park. Instead, they pulled up to a building that smelled like fear and cleaning solution, and too many animals in too small a space. The shelter. His first shelter. They'd said goodbye quickly, the way people do when lingering makes things harder. The woman had cried, the man had looked away, and Max had stood there, leash in a stranger's hand, watching the car pull out of the parking lot and disappear around the corner. He'd waited by the door for hours that first day, certain they'd realize the mistake and come back for him. They never did. His first adoption had come within 2 weeks. A young couple, eager and smiling, had chosen him because he seemed chill and low maintenance. They'd taken him to a house that smelled new, with floors so clean, Max was afraid to walk on them, but he'd tried. He'd tried to be what they wanted, to fit into their lives the way he'd fit into his first family's. It didn't work. They wanted a dog who'd hike with them on weekends, who'd run alongside their bikes, who'd play fetch until the sun went down. Max tried, but his energy had never been boundless. He preferred short walks and long naps. He liked to sit quietly and watch the world rather than chase through it. After 3 months, they decided he wasn't the right fit and brought him back. The second adoption had been with an older woman who lived alone. That one had felt promising. She'd moved slowly, spoke softly, and seemed to understand that Max needed time to settle in. But she'd had another dog, a territorial terrier mix who'd made it clear from day one that Max was not welcome. There'd been growling, snapping, tension that hung in the air like smoke. The woman had tried to make it work, but after 6 weeks of stress and separation, she tearfully returned him, saying she couldn't manage both dogs. The third adoption had been the shortest and the most confusing. A family with teenagers had chosen him, saying they wanted a calm dog who wouldn't be too much work. But within 10 days he was back. No explanation. No apology. Just a return as if he were a purchase that hadn't met expectations. Each time, Max had gone back to the shelter a little more defeated. Each time, the hope that had flickered when new people smiled at him dimmed a little more. He'd learned that love could be conditional, that home was a temporary concept, that even when you tried your best, sometimes your best wasn't enough. The shelter staff had started to recognize him. Max is back, they'd say, not unkindly, but with a resignation that stung worse than anger would have. They put him in a kennel, update his file and watch as he settled into the routine like someone slipping into old, worn clothing. By the time he'd been returned the third time, Max had stopped expecting much. He'd stopped rushing to the front of his kennel when people walked by. He'd stopped wagging his tail at every stranger's voice. He'd learned to conserve his energy, to protect the small, quiet part of himself that still believed in goodness, even when goodness felt far away. The shelter had become more familiar than any home. The sounds, the smells, the daily rhythm, it was all he could count on now. And in a strange way, that consistency was almost comforting. At least here, nobody pretended things would last forever. At least here, expectations were low enough that he couldn't disappoint anyone. As the months passed and his muzzle grew grayer, Max settled into a kind of acceptance. This was his life now. This kennel, this routine, this waiting. Some dogs left quickly. Some dogs stayed longer. And some dogs, like him, just learned to exist in the in-between. But existence isn't the same as living, and somewhere deep down, Max still carried a small, stubborn hope that refused to die completely. The third time Max was returned to the shelter, he didn't resist. He walked through the double doors with his head low and his tail still, following the familiar path to the intake area like someone who'd memorized every step. The shelter staff member leading him, a woman named Sarah with kind eyes and a gentle voice, kept the leash loose. She knew Max didn't need much directing. He knew where he was going. "Hey there, buddy," she'd said softly when the family had handed her his leash in the parking lot. "Welcome back. Welcome back." As if this were a place anyone would want to return to. But Sarah's tone held no judgment, only a quiet sadness that Max had felt more than once in his life. It was the sadness of people who cared, but couldn't fix everything, who saw too many animals come and go, too many stories that didn't end the way they should. The intake process was routine by now. Weight check, health assessment, kennel assignment. Sarah had moved efficiently, but without rushing, speaking to Max in low tones as she worked. "You're doing good, just a little longer. We'll get you settled." His weight had dropped slightly since his last stay. Not enough to be alarming, but enough to note in his file. Senior dogs sometimes lost their appetite in stressful situations, and being returned qualified as stress, even for a dog as stoic as Max. Sarah had made a note to monitor his food intake, to maybe add some wet food to make meals more appealing. The health check had been brief. Max's joints were showing signs of age, a little stiffness in his back legs. Nothing severe yet, but enough to explain why he didn't bound around like the younger dogs. His teeth needed cleaning, a common issue for older dogs, but otherwise he was healthy. Tired, perhaps, worn down in ways that didn't show up on a medical chart. But physically, he was sound. When it came time to assign him a kennel, Sarah had walked him to the same section where he'd stayed before. The back corner, away from the main flow of foot traffic. Quieter. Less overwhelming. She'd opened the gate and Max had walked in without hesitation, immediately going to the far corner where a blanket had already been placed. He'd circled once, twice, then lowered himself down with a soft exhale that sounded almost like relief. "I'm sorry, Max," Sarah had whispered, crouching down outside the kennel. "You deserve better than this." But Max hadn't looked at her. He'd rested his head on his paws and stared at the far wall, his eyes distant and unfocused. Sarah had stayed there for a minute longer, then stood and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. The shelter around him had hummed with familiar sounds, dogs barking in the distance, some with excitement, some with frustration, some with loneliness. The clatter of food bowls being filled, the whoosh of water running through pipes, the occasional slam of a door. These sounds had once felt foreign to Max, but now they were just background noise. as unremarkable as breathing. In the kennel next to his, a young pit bull mixed-paced anxiously, whining at intervals and pawing at the gate. New arrival, Max guessed, still hoping someone would come back for them, still believing this was temporary. Max didn't have the heart to tell them that temporary could stretch into weeks, months, longer. That hope was exhausting when it had nowhere to land. The first few days after a return were always the hardest. Max knew this from experience. The other dogs would settle eventually. The routine would become familiar again, and the sharp edges of disappointment would dull into something more manageable. But those first few days felt like starting over, like being broken all over again. He ate sparingly despite Sarah's efforts to tempt him with extra food. He walked when taken out, but without enthusiasm, just putting one paw in front of the other because that's what was expected. He slept a lot, or at least pretended to, keeping his eyes closed, even when the kennel lights were on and activity buzzed around him. The other shelter staff treated him with a gentleness that bordered on pity. They'd stop by his kennel more often than necessary, offering soft words and extra treats. Tom, the weekend volunteer, had sat outside Max's kennel on Saturday and read the entire sports section aloud, his voice a steady drone that was oddly comforting. Max had listened without moving, letting the words wash over him like rain on the window. People came to the shelter every day, potential adopters looking for their perfect match, families with children, couples holding hands, individuals looking for companionship. They'd walk down the rows of kennels, stopping at the ones that caught their attention. Max had learned not to get up when they passed anymore. There was no point. They weren't looking for a senior dog with gray fur and tired eyes. They were looking for potential, for energy, for years of companionship ahead. Max represented endings, not beginnings. He was a reminder that dogs grew old, that time passed, that commitment was measured in decades, not months. And most people, when faced with that reality, chose to look elsewhere. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when Max felt something other than resignation. When Sarah would sit beside his kennel during her break and tell him about her day, when Tom would sneak him an extra biscuit and whisper, "You're a good boy, Max. Don't let anyone tell you different." When the morning light would hit his blanket just right, warm and golden, and for a second he'd remember what it felt like to be comfortable. These moments didn't erase the hard parts. They didn't make the waiting easier or the loneliness less sharp, but they were something. Small bits of kindness in a place that often felt devoid of it, and Max, despite everything, still recognized kindness when it was offered. As the days turned into weeks, Max settled back into shelter life, with the resignation of someone who'd done this before. He knew the rhythm, he knew what to expect, and he knew, deep down, that this might be where his story ended. Not with cruelty or neglect, but with quiet obscurity in a kennel that nobody noticed. But stories have a way of surprising us, even when we've stopped expecting them to. The pattern became predictable within the first month. Saturday mornings brought the most foot traffic families fresh from breakfast, dressed casually, ready to find their new family member. Max would hear them coming before he saw them. The excited chatter of children, the murmured discussions between adults about what kind of dog they wanted. They'd start at the front kennels where the younger dogs were housed. The puppies always went first, their tiny paws scrabbling against the gates, their high-pitched barks impossible to ignore. Then they'd move to the adolescent dogs, the ones with energy to burn and years of loyalty ahead of them. By the time they reached Max's section in the back, many families had already made their decision. They'd walk past his kennel with barely a glance, their attention already claimed by a lab mix 3 kennels down, or a beagle blend across the hall. Max had learned to recognize the types of people who walked through. The young couples who wanted a jogging partner. The families with small children who needed a patient, playful companion. The elderly individuals who walked slowly and read every kennel card carefully, though even they usually chose younger dogs, perhaps fearing they wouldn't outlive a senior pet. Occasionally, someone would stop at Max's kennel. They'd read his card, tilt their heads thoughtfully, maybe even crouch down to get a better look. Max would meet their eyes, not with the desperate enthusiasm of younger dogs, but with a quiet steadiness that said, "I'm here, I'm waiting, I'm worth your time." But then they'd read the word senior on his card, or they'd notice the gray around his muzzle, or they'd ask a staff member about his age, and something would shift. Their expressions would soften with sympathy, but their feet would already be moving on. Such a sweet face, they'd say, but we're really looking for a younger dog, something with more energy, you understand. Max understood perfectly. He understood that he represented commitment to the unknown, that adopting a senior dog meant facing goodbye sooner, that medical bills might pile up, that time was already running short, that the years of puppyhood and playfulness were behind him. He understood all of it, even if it stung each time someone chose understanding over action. There was a family that had stopped at his kennel one Sunday afternoon, a woman and 2 teenage daughters, all 3 of them with the same warm brown eyes. They'd crouched down, speaking softly to Max through the bars. "Hi there, sweet boy. Aren't you handsome?" Max had risen slowly, his joints stiff from lying down most of the morning, and walked to the front of the kennel. He'd sat like he'd been taught years ago and waited. The younger daughter had reached her fingers through the bars, letting Max sniff them before gently scratching under his chin. "Mom, I really like him," the girl had said. The mother had smiled, reading his card. "He's older, honey. It says here he's been returned 3 times. "But that's not his fault," the older daughter had argued. Maybe those people just didn't understand what they had. For a moment, Max had let himself hope. For a moment, he'd imagined leaving this kennel, riding in their car, sleeping in a home that smelled like laundry detergent and cooking food. For a moment, the future had looked different, but the mother had shaken her head gently. "I know, sweetheart, but we talked about this. We want a dog who'll grow up with you, who'll be around for your high school years, maybe even college. This boy deserves a wonderful home, but I don't think we're it." They'd stood, offered Max apologetic smiles, and moved on. The younger daughter had looked back twice, her expression conflicted, but she'd followed her mother and sister down the row. Within 10 minutes, they'd stopped at a young shepherd mix kennel, and Max had heard the excited conversation that meant someone was about to find their forever home. It wasn't the first time Max had been chosen and then unchosen within minutes. It wouldn't be the last. Sarah had found him later that afternoon, still sitting at the front of his kennel, staring at nothing. She'd sat down on the floor outside his gate, her back against the wall, and let out a long sigh. "I saw that family stop here," she'd said quietly. "I was hoping." Max had looked at her, then away. "You're a good dog, Max. The best, really. It's not fair that people can't see that they only see the gray fur and the number on your card." She paused, reaching through the bars to rest her hand near Max's paw. "Someone will see you. Really see you. I have to believe that." But belief was easier for humans. They had the luxury of hope without the weight of repeated disappointment. Max had learned to protect himself by expecting less, by building walls around the parts of him that still wanted to trust that tomorrow might be different. The weeks blurred together. More Saturdays came and went. More families stopped and moved on. Max watched younger dogs arrive and leave within days, sometimes hours. He watched his kennel neighbors change regularly, while his name card stayed the same, slightly faded now from weeks under the fluorescent lights. Tom had started bringing a folding chair to sit beside Max's kennel on his volunteer days. He'd read aloud, sometimes from the newspaper, sometimes from novels he'd bring from home. Max didn't understand all the words, but he understood the gesture. Tom was saying, "You're worth my time. You're worth sitting with." The shelter staff had started rotating Max's walks to different volunteers, hoping fresh faces might spark some energy in him. But Max walked the same, regardless of who held the leash steady, unhurried, without the pulling and sniffing enthusiasm of younger dogs. He'd do his business, walk the perimeter of the yard, and wait patiently by the gate to return to his kennel. "He's depressed," one volunteer had whispered to another, thinking Max couldn't hear. Poor thing's just given up. But it wasn't quite giving up. It was more like surrender, not to defeat, but to reality. Max had learned that you could survive disappointment by lowering your expectations, that you could endure loneliness by accepting it as normal, that you could exist in a space between hope and hopelessness, where neither emotion had enough power to break you. And so he existed, day after day, in a kennel that nobody noticed, being overlooked by people who were looking for something else, something younger, something with more time left on the clock. What Max didn't know yet was that being overlooked isn't the same as being unseen. That sometimes the right person is looking for exactly what everyone else passes by. That sometimes patience isn't about waiting for nothing. It's about waiting for exactly the right something. But he didn't know that yet. For now, he simply lay in his corner, watched the world move past his kennel, and counted the quiet hours until tomorrow. Summer turned to fall, and fall eased into winter. Max measured time not by calendars, but by the changing quality of light through the high windows of the shelter. The bright, harsh light of July became the softer, golden light of October. Then came the gray, short days of December, when darkness fell early and the shelter felt even more enclosed than usual. His blanket had been replaced twice, each new one slightly different in color but identical in function. The water bowl that reflected light had gained a small dent on one side. The kennel card with his name had been updated with new dates, marking milestones nobody celebrated. 3 months at the shelter. 4 months. 5. By the time winter settled in fully, Max had been there for 6 months straight. Half a year in the same kennel, the same routine, the same waiting. Other dogs had come and gone so many times. Max had stopped learning their names. There was no point in forming attachments to neighbors who'd be gone within a week. The shelter staff had started treating him differently. Not unkindly, never, none kindly, but with the resigned gentleness reserved for long-term residents. They'd stopped saying things like, "Your family will come soon," and started saying things like, "Let's make today good, okay, buddy?" It was a subtle shift, but Max felt it. They were no longer promising him a future. They were just trying to make his present bearable. Sarah had arranged for extra enrichment activities. Puzzle feeders to keep his mind engaged. New toys that squeaked or crinkled, though Max rarely played with them. Special treats on Fridays, just because. She'd even gotten permission to let Max spend time in the shelter's small office on particularly quiet afternoons, where he could lie on a dog bed by the heater and watch Sarah work. Those office afternoons were Max's favorite part of the week. The space was warm and smelled like coffee and paper. Sarah would talk to him while she typed, her voice a constant, soothing presence. "Let's see, Max. We've got 3 adoptions this week. That beagle mix finally found his people. Remember him? The one who wouldn't stop howling? His new family loves his voice. Can you believe it? There's someone for everyone, I guess." Max would lie there, his chin resting on the edge of the dog bed, and let himself relax in a way he couldn't in his kennel. Here, he wasn't waiting to be chosen. He wasn't being passed over. He was just existing in a quiet space with someone who seemed to genuinely enjoy his company. Tom's reading sessions had become more regular, too. Every Saturday and Sunday, without fail, he'd arrive with a book in his folding chair. He'd settled into reading adventure novels, stories about journeys and discoveries and people finding where they belonged. Max didn't follow the plots, but he liked the rhythm of Tom's voice, the way he'd pause dramatically at exciting parts or soften his tone during peaceful moments. "You know what, Max?" Tom had said one Sunday, closing his book and looking through the kennel bars. "These stories always end with someone finding home. Sometimes it takes the whole book, sometimes it happens in the last chapter, but it always happens. I think that's how your story goes too. We're just not at the end yet." But Max had learned that human stories and dog stories didn't always follow the same patterns. In human stories, good things came to those who waited, lessons were learned, and patience was rewarded. In dog stories, at least, in Max's story, waiting was just waiting, and sometimes that's all it ever amounted to. The holidays came and went. The shelter had decorated with lights and paper snowflakes, trying to make the space feel festive. Volunteers had brought in special treats, and a local pet store had donated toys for all the animals. Max had received a new rope toy that sat untouched in his kennel, and extra servings of turkey on Christmas Day. Families had flooded the shelter the week before Christmas, looking for pets to give as gifts. Max had watched the chaos from his back kennel, the excited children, the harried parents, the staff trying to ensure animals went to responsible homes and not just under Christmas trees. Several dogs from his section had been adopted during that rush, but not Max. Never Max. January brought a different kind of quiet to the shelter. The post-holiday returns, as Sarah called them. Dogs who'd been gifts, who hadn't worked out, who'd been chosen impulsively and returned with regret. Max recognized the shell-shocked look in their eyes as they were processed through intake. He remembered that feeling. The confusion, The sense of failure, the not understanding what you did wrong. A young boxer mix had been placed in the kennel next to Max's, returned after just 2 weeks because he'd had too much energy for his adopter's apartment. The dog paced anxiously for days, whining and pawing at the gate. Max had watched without intervention, knowing that nothing he could do would ease that particular pain. It just had to be endured. But time, Max had learned, did soften things. The boxer eventually stopped pacing as much. His whines became less frequent. He started eating regularly again. Within 3 weeks, a new family had adopted him, people with a yard and experience with energetic breeds. Max had watched him leave, tail wagging with renewed hope, and felt nothing but a distant, weary sort of gladness. February arrived with cold rain and gray skies. Max's arthritis had gotten worse in the damp weather, making his movements slower and stiffer. Sarah had started him on supplements, small pills hidden in cheese that Max swallowed without complaint. They helped some, enough that his morning walks weren't quite so uncomfortable. The rain drummed against the shelter roof, a constant percussion that became white noise after a while. Max would lie on his blanket and listen to it, letting his mind drift to nowhere in particular. He thought about the house with the porch, the woman who'd hummed while cooking, the man who'd scratched behind his ears just right. He thought about them sometimes, not with anger or longing, but with the detached curiosity of someone remembering a dream. Had they ever thought about him? Did they wonder where he was now? If he'd found a good home, or had he become just a memory, softened by time and distance, a dog they'd once known whose name they might struggle to recall? These questions had no answers, and Max had stopped needing them. The past was behind him, unchangeable. The future was uncertain, unknowable. All he had was this moment, this kennel, this day, and the next one after that. Time continued its steady march forward, indifferent to hope or despair. And Max, patient as ever, continued to exist within it, waiting for something he'd almost stopped believing would come. Almost, but not quite. The quiet moments were what Max lived for now. Not the loud ones, when groups of potential adopters walked through and hope fluttered painfully in his chest. Not even the routine ones, with their predictable rhythms and familiar faces. But the quiet moments, when the world seemed to pause and he could simply exist without expectation. Tuesday afternoons in Sarah's office had become sacred. She'd come to his kennel around 2 o'clock, after the lunch rush had settled, and before the evening volunteer shift began. "Want to come keep me company, Max?" she'd ask, though it wasn't really a question. She'd clip on his leash, and he'd follow her down the hallway, past the other kennels, through 2 doors, and into the small room that had become his sanctuary. The office was cluttered in a comfortable way. Papers stacked on the desk, a calendar on the wall with scribbled notes, a space heater in the corner that hummed with warmth. Sarah had set up a dog bed by the window months ago, specifically for Max, though she'd never explicitly said so. It was always there when he arrived, the afternoon sun warming it to the perfect temperature. Max would settle onto the bed with a soft groan, his joints thanking him for the cushioned surface. Sarah would sit at her desk, typing or writing or making phone calls, and Max would drift in that space between sleeping and waking, where thoughts were loose and formless. Sometimes Sarah talked to him while she worked. About the shelter, about the dogs who'd been adopted that week, about her life outside these walls. Max learned that she had 2 cats at home, both rescues, that she'd wanted to be a veterinarian but had settled for shelter management instead, that she believed every animal deserved a chance, even when the odds were stacked against them. "You know what I think, Max?" she'd said one Tuesday, swiveling her chair to look at him. "I think the right person for you is someone who understands that the best things aren't always wrapped in shiny paper. Someone who knows that loyalty and love don't have expiration dates. Someone patient enough to wait for the right dog, the way you've been patient waiting for them." Max had lifted his head slightly, meeting her eyes. Sarah had smiled, sad but genuine. "I know you're tired of waiting. I know this isn't fair. But I haven't given up on you. Don't give up on yourself, okay?" It was an impossible request, really. How could he not give up when every day looked the same, when every person walked past, when even Sarah's kindness couldn't change the fundamental reality of his situation? But Max had nodded anyway, in the way dogs do when they sense emotion, even if they don't understand words. because Sarah's belief in him mattered, even if he couldn't quite share it. Tom's weekend reading sessions had evolved into something more. He'd started bringing 2 cups of coffee now, one for himself, one that sat cooling on the floor while he read. Max had learned that Tom was a retired teacher, that he'd lost his own dog 2 years ago, and wasn't quite ready for another, but that spending time with Max filled something he'd been missing. "My Sadie was a senior rescue too," Tom had told Max one Sunday, his voice soft with memory. "Everyone said I was crazy adopting a 10-year-old dog. She won't live long, they said. It'll just break your heart sooner. But you know what? Those 4 years with her were worth every moment of heartbreak. She taught me that time isn't what matters. It's what you do with it." Tom had paused, looking directly at Max. "You've got time left, buddy. Good time. And whoever gets to share it with you is going to be lucky. They just don't know it yet." These were the moments Max treasured. Not the waiting, not the being overlooked, but these pockets of genuine connection, when he wasn't just a kennel number or a senior dog statistic, but Max. When people saw him, really saw him, and chose to spend time with him anyway. There were other quiet moments too, early mornings before the shelter woke up, when Max could hear birds outside the high windows. The sound reminded him of yards he'd known, of mornings on porches, of a world beyond concrete and metal bars. He'd close his eyes and let the bird song transport him, just for a few minutes, to somewhere else. The evening hours, after dinner, when the shelter settled into a different kind of routine, staff members finishing paperwork, volunteers completing final walks, the building slowly quieting as closing time approached. Max would watch the light change through his window, the harsh fluorescent glow giving way to the softer shadows of dusk. Sometimes, late at night when he thought nobody was around, Max would allow himself to remember what affection felt like. A hand on his head, scratching just right, a voice saying his name with warmth instead of just necessity. The weight of a body next to his, sharing space and warmth. He'd remember, and it would ache. But it was better than forgetting, better than letting go of the idea that good things had existed once and might exist again. One Thursday afternoon, a little girl had stopped at Max's kennel with her mother. The child couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, with pigtails and a bright pink jacket. She pressed her face to the bars, her breath fogging the metal. "Mama, look, he looks sad." The mother had glanced at Max, then at her daughter. "Some dogs take longer to find homes, honey, but I'm sure someone nice will choose him soon." The girl had been quiet for a moment, then said something that stuck with Max long after they'd walked away. "Maybe he's not sad. Maybe he's just waiting very patiently. That's different." Out of the mouths of children, as humans say. Because she was right. Max wasn't sad exactly. Sad implied an active emotion, a raw grief. What Max felt was more like weariness, like patience stretched so thin it had become translucent. He was waiting, and waiting required endurance more than hope. But in the quiet moments, when sunlight warmed his bed, or Tom's voice filled the space around his kennel, or Sarah's hand reached through the bars to scratch behind his ears, Max felt something close to contentment, not happiness that seemed too far out of reach, but contentment. A quiet acceptance that this was his life, and within it, there were still moments worth experiencing. The shelter would never be home, but these moments, these small pockets of peace and connection, they were something. And for now, something was enough to keep going. Spring was coming, Sarah had mentioned. The days were getting longer, warmer. Soon the shelter would do their annual spring adoption event with discounted fees and special promotions. Maybe that would be Max's chance. Maybe someone would finally see past the gray fur and the senior label and recognize what Tom and Sarah already knew. Or maybe not. Maybe Max would spend another season in this kennel, watching the light change, counting the quiet hours, existing in the space between what was and what could be. Either way, he'd endure, because that's what he knew how to do. And in the quiet moments, that knowledge was enough. It was a Thursday afternoon in late March when everything began to shift, though Max didn't recognize it immediately. The day had started like any other morning, feeding. A brief walk in the yard where early spring flowers were beginning to push through the dirt. Return to his kennel, and the long stretch of afternoon hours ahead. Sarah had mentioned that morning that they were expecting a visitor around 2 o'clock, someone who called ahead, which was unusual. Most people just showed up on weekends, walked the rows and made impulsive decisions. But this person had asked specific questions on the phone about senior dogs, about temperament over energy, about dogs who'd been overlooked. Max had been dozing when he heard footsteps approaching his section, accompanied by Sarah's voice. "This is our senior wing, though we don't officially call it that. These dogs have been with us a while. They're wonderful animals. They just need someone who understands what they have to offer." "I understand," said another voice. Male, quiet, measured. "I'm not looking for a jogging partner. I'm looking for company." The footsteps stopped at Max's kennel. Max lifted his head, more out of habit than expectation. He'd heard many voices, seen many faces. This would be no different. But the man who stood there didn't look like the usual visitors. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with gray hair and weathered hands that suggested a lifetime of work. He wore simple clothes jeans, a flannel shirt, work boots that had seen better days. His face was kind but tired, etched with lines that spoke of both laughter and loss. He didn't crouch down immediately or make exaggerated happy sounds like many visitors did. Instead, he stood quietly, reading Max's kennel card with careful attention. Then he lowered himself slowly, with the stiffness of someone whose joints remembered years, and sat cross-legged on the floor. "Hello, Max," he said simply. Max regarded him from his blanket. The man made no move to reach through the bars or call him over. He just sat, patient and still, as if he had all the time in the world. Sarah watched from a respectful distance. "That's Max. He's been with us about 7 months now. He's been adopted before, but it didn't work out. Not because of anything he did wrong," she added quickly. "Just bad matches." The man nodded slowly. Sometimes the best things take the longest to find their place. There was something in his voice, a sadness that matched the sadness Max carried. Not self-pity, not bitterness, but the quiet grief of someone who'd experienced loss and learned to carry it with dignity. Max recognized it because he felt it himself. After a long moment, the man extended his hand, palm up, against the kennel bars, not demanding, not expecting, just offering. Max stood slowly, his legs stiff from lying down. He walked to the front of the kennel, paused, then stretched his neck to sniff the offered hand. It smelled like coffee and soap and something earthy, maybe garden soil. After a moment's consideration, Max pressed his nose against the palm, a gesture of tentative trust. The man smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Nice to meet you too, buddy." They sat like that for several minutes, the man's hand against the bars, Max's head near it, neither pushing for more than the other was ready to give. Sarah had seen enough adoptions to recognize something special when she saw it, and she quietly excused herself to give them space. "My name's Robert," the man said eventually. "I lost my wife 6 months ago. Cancer. We'd been married 38 years. He paused, his voice steady but soft. "The house is too quiet now. I thought maybe we could keep each other company, if you're interested." Max couldn't understand all the words, but he understood the tone. This wasn't someone looking for excitement or energy. This was someone who understood loneliness, who knew what it meant to be left behind, who wasn't afraid of gray muzzles and uncertain futures. Robert visited for over an hour that first day. He didn't ask to walk Max or take him to the play yard. He just sat by the kennel, talking softly about his life, his wife, his quiet home with too many empty rooms, about the garden he still tended because she loved it, about the porch where they used to sit in the evenings, watching the sunset. When he finally stood to leave, his knees creaking in protest, he looked at Max with an expression that held no pity, only recognition. "I'm gonna think about this," he said, "but I wanted to meet you first, see if we might fit together." Max watched him walk away with Sarah, their voices low and serious. He felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not quite hope, because hope was too fragile, but possibility. The smallest seed of maybe. Robert came back the next day, and the day after that. Each visit, he'd sit by Max's kennel for an hour or more, Sometimes talking, sometimes just reading a book aloud the way Tom did. Max began to anticipate his footsteps, to recognize the scent that preceded his arrival. On the fourth visit, Sarah let Robert into the kennel. "Take your time," she said, closing the gate behind him. "Get to know each other." Robert lowered himself onto Max's blanket with a groan that Max understood in his bones. They sat side by side, Robert's hand resting on Max's head, neither demanding anything from the other except presence. "I've thought about it," Robert said quietly, "about whether I have enough to give. Whether it's fair to adopt a senior dog when I'm getting older myself. Whether I can handle losing you when the time comes." He paused, his hand gentle on Max's fur. "But then I realized something. We're both running out of time, you and me. The question isn't how much time we have. It's what we do with whatever time is left." Max leaned slightly into Robert's side, a movement so small it might have been missed by someone not paying attention. But Robert noticed. He wrapped his arm around Max's shoulders and said, "Yeah, I think we understand each other." The adoption process took a week. Sarah wanted to ensure everything was right, that this wouldn't be another return. Robert was patient, answering questions, filling out paperwork, preparing his home. He brought photos to show Max a fenced yard, a covered porch with a dog bed already waiting, rooms with hardwood floors worn smooth by time. "It's not fancy," he'd said, showing Max the pictures through the kennel bars. "But it's peaceful, and it's yours if you want it." On the day Robert came to take him home, Max walked out of the kennel with steady steps. Sarah had tears in her eyes. Tom had come by to say goodbye, pressing an extra biscuit into Robert's hand. "For the road," he'd said, his voice gruff with emotion. As Robert led Max through the shelter doors for the last time, Sarah called out, "Take care of each other." Robert had looked back and nodded, "We will." And Max, for the first time in 7 months, walked toward a car not with resignation, but with something cautiously close to hope, because sometimes the right person isn't the one who chooses you quickly. Sometimes the right person is the one who takes their time, who sits with you in your sadness, who recognizes that broken pieces can still fit together beautifully. Sometimes the turning point doesn't announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it's just a quiet man sitting on a concrete floor, offering his hand and his heart, and waiting patiently for you to accept both. The car ride to Robert's house was quiet. Max sat in the back seat on a blanket Robert had spread out, watching unfamiliar streets pass by the window. He'd been in cars before, to his first shelter, to each of his adoptions, back to the shelter each time it hadn't worked out. Cars meant transitions, and transitions had taught Max to be cautious. But Robert drove slowly, without hurry, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror and offering soft words. "Doing okay back there, buddy? We're almost home. Just a few more minutes." The word home had lost meaning for Max somewhere along the way. It had become just a sound, a placeholder for temporary spaces that never lasted. But something in Robert's voice made the word feel different. Less like a promise, more like a simple truth. They pulled onto a street lined with older houses, trees that had been grown for decades, sidewalks cracked and settled with time. Robert's house was modest, a single-story ranch with faded blue paint and a porch that wrapped around the front. The yard was neat but lived in, with flower beds showing the first signs of spring growth and a fence that looked sturdy despite its age. Robert parked in the driveway and sat for a moment before getting out. "This is it, Max. Not much to look at, but it's solid. Been here 35 years. Jean and I bought it when houses like this were all we could afford." He smiled sadly. "Thought we'd fill it with kids, but that didn't happen. So it's been just us. And now, if you're willing, it'll be us." He opened the back door and Max stepped out carefully, his paws meeting warm concrete. The air smelled different. Here, grass and flowers and something cooking in the neighbor's house. Sounds were different too. Birds singing, a distant lawnmower, wind rustling through trees. No barking dogs, no metal gates clanging shut. Robert led Max to the front porch, moving slowly enough that Max never felt rushed. Jean always said the porch was her favorite part of the house. Said she could sit out here and watch the whole world go by without having to be part of it. He gestured to a large dog bed positioned in the corner, sheltered from the elements. "Thought you might like it too." Inside, the house was exactly as the photos had shown. Hardwood floors, Worn furniture that looked comfortable rather than stylish. Walls covered with photographs of a life well lived. Max could smell the lingering scent of someone who'd been gone for a while, perfume and lotion, and something distinctly feminine that had faded but not disappeared. "Jean," he assumed. Robert gave him a tour, his voice gentle and unhurried. "Kitchen's through here. Your food and water bowls are already set up. Bathroom's down the hall. Not that you need to know that, but I'm in the habit of giving tours." He smiled. "Bedroom's at the end. There's a doll bed next to the bed if you want to sleep nearby. Or you can sleep anywhere you like. House is yours now, too." Max explored cautiously, sniffing corners and doorways, learning the layout. Everything smelled like Robert coffee and soap, and that earthy garden scent. But underneath, that other smell persisted. Jean's absence was a presence all its own. "I haven't changed much since she passed," Robert said, watching Max explore. "Probably should. People keep saying I should pack up her things, paint the walls, move on." He made air quotes with his fingers. "But I'm not ready. Maybe I never will be. That okay with you?" Max looked at him, and for a moment they were just two beings who understood loss. Who knew that moving on wasn't always possible or even desirable. That sometimes you just learn to carry what you'd lost and keep living anyway. Robert showed Max the backyard next to decent-sized space with grass that needed mowing and those flower beds Jean had loved. "You can go out whenever you need to. I put in a dog door years ago for our last dog, Rusty. Still works fine, see?" He demonstrated, and Max watched the flap swing back and forth. They spent the rest of the afternoon in a comfortable routine. Robert made himself lunch and gave Max his dinner early, wanting to keep his shelter schedule consistent until he adjusted. They sat on the porch together as the sun began its descent, Robert in a weathered rocking chair, Max on his new bed, both of them watching the neighborhood wind down from the day. "Jean would have liked you," Robert said as the light turned golden. "She always preferred the quiet dogs. Said the loudest ones were usually the most insecure and the quiet ones had nothing to prove." He rocked slowly, the chair creaking. "She was right about most things." A neighbor walked by walking their dog, a young golden retriever who pulled enthusiastically at the leash. The neighbor waved, and Robert waved back. "That's Margaret. She'll probably stop by tomorrow to meet you. She's been after me to get a dog since Jean passed. Said the house was too quiet." He looked at Max. She was right about that too. As evening settled in, Robert stood and stretched. "What do you say we call it a day? I don't know about you, but I'm tired. Getting old is exhausting work." Inside, Robert went through his bedtime routine, brushing his teeth, changing into soft pajamas, setting a glass of water on his nightstand. Max watched from the dog bed Robert had placed beside the bed, positioned so they could see each other. Robert turned off the light and settled under the covers with a sigh. The room fell into darkness, broken only by moonlight filtering through the curtains. For a long moment there was just breathing, Robert's slow and steady, Max's slightly faster, both finding rhythm in the quiet. "Good night, Max," Robert said softly. "I'm glad you're here." Max closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come immediately. He was listening, learning the sounds of this new place, the house settling, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic. Different from the shelter, but not uncomfortable. Just different. Sometime in the night, Max got up and moved, not to leave, but to adjust. He positioned himself closer to Robert's bed, close enough that he could hear the man's breathing clearly, could feel the presence of another living being nearby. Robert stirred, reached down in the darkness, and let his hand rest on Max's head for a moment. "Yeah," he whispered, "me too." And for the first time in longer than Max could remember, he fell asleep not to the sounds of a shelter or the loneliness of waiting, but to the simple comfort of companionship, of being chosen not despite his age and his history, but perhaps because of it. The leaving hadn't been an ending. It had been a beginning. A quiet, unremarkable beginning maybe, but a beginning nonetheless. The days settled into a rhythm that Max had never known before, not in his first home, not in any of his adoptions, and certainly not in the shelter. This rhythm was different because it wasn't imposed on him. It emerged naturally from the way two beings learned to share space and time. Robert woke early, around 6, and Max learned to wake with him. They'd step out onto the porch together, Robert with his coffee, Max sniffing the morning air, both of them watching the neighborhood come alive. The paperboy on his bike, Margaret from next door leaving for her morning walk, birds establishing territorial claims in the trees. Breakfast came next. Robert ate simple meals, toast and eggs, oatmeal with fruit, and Max had his kibble with a spoonful of wet food mixed in, the way Sarah had recommended. They ate in the kitchen, Robert at the small table, Max at his bowl. A comfortable silence between them, broken only by the clink of spoons and the crunch of kibble. Then came the garden. This was Robert's morning ritual, and Max quickly made it his own. Robert would spend an hour among Jean's flower beds, weeding and watering, talking to the plants the way he'd probably talk to his wife. Max would lie in a patch of sun nearby, watching without expectation, his presence serving no purpose except to be present. Jean always said gardens teach patience, Robert said one morning, his hands deep in soil. You can't rush growth. You plant, you water, you wait. And if you're lucky and the conditions are right, something beautiful happens. He looked at Max. Kind of like us, I suppose. We're growing into this, taking our time, no rush. Midday brought the porch. This was Max's favorite time, when the world grew quiet and still. Robert would read or work on small projects, fixing a cabinet hinge, organizing old photographs, writing letters to friends who'd known Jean. Max would sleep on his bed, the warmth soaking into his old bones, easing the stiffness that had become his constant companion. Sometimes neighbors would stop by. Margaret came most often, usually with homemade treats, cookies for Robert, dog biscuits for Max. She'd sit and chat, filling Robert in on neighborhood gossip, asking how Max was settling in. He's perfect, Robert would say, and it was true in the way that truth isn't about flawlessness, but about rightness. Max wasn't perfect. He still limped on cold mornings. He still startled at sudden loud noises. He still carried the wariness of someone who'd been disappointed before. But in this house, with this man, those imperfections didn't need fixing. They just needed accepting. Afternoons might bring a walk around the neighborhood, slow and meandering, both man and dog moving at a pace that accommodated aging joints. Robert would greet neighbors, stop to examine gardens, let Max sniff whatever interested him without pulling or hurrying. We're not trying to win any races, Robert said during one of these walks. Just getting some air, seeing what's out there. Right, Max? Max had learned that Robert asked questions without expecting answers, understanding that companionship didn't require constant dialogue. Sometimes silence said more than words ever could. Evenings were for the porch again, this time watching the sunset. Robert in his rocking chair, Max on his bed, both of them witnessing the day's end, with the satisfaction of time well spent. The light would shift from gold to pink to purple to deep blue, and Robert would talk about Jean. She loved this time of day, said it felt like the world was taking a deep breath before night came. He'd rock slowly, rhythmically. I miss her most in the evenings. That's when we'd sit out here together, planning the next day, or remembering the one we just had. 38 years of evenings, and it still wasn't enough. Max had learned that grief was like his own history, always present, sometimes sharper than other times, but manageable if you didn't fight it. Robert didn't fight his grief. He lived with it, made room for it, let it exist alongside his daily joys. 1 month became 2, then 3. Spring eased into summer. The flower beds Jean had planted years ago bloomed spectacularly, as if making up for her absence with excess beauty. Robert tended them carefully, and Max watched from his sunny spot, the garden's fragrance mixing with grass and earth, and the distant smell of someone grilling dinner. Max's health improved, slightly better food, regular meals, less stress. His coat gained some shine. The arthritis was still there, but Sarah's supplements helped, and the soft dog beds placed throughout the house eased his joints. He was still old, still gray-muzzled, still carrying the years, but he was comfortable, and comfort was something he'd almost forgotten existed. Robert had started talking to Max about everything, his thoughts, his memories, his daily observations. "Talked to my daughter on the phone today," he'd say. "She lives in Oregon. Keeps asking when I'll visit, but honestly, I don't like leaving the garden. Or you now. You're terrible at taking care of yourself when I'm gone." He'd smile, scratching behind Max's ears. "Just kidding. You'd probably be fine, but I'd miss you." The truth was evident in the smallest moments. The way Robert would reach down to touch Max's head when walking past. The way he'd save the best scraps from dinner for Max's bowl. The way he'd position furniture so Max always had a view of whatever room Robert was in. These weren't grand gestures of love, but they were gestures nonetheless. And Max had learned that sometimes the smallest gestures meant the most. There were hard days too. Days when Robert's grief sat heavier on his shoulders, when he'd spend hours looking at photographs of Jean, when his voice would break mid-sentence. On those days, Max would stay close, his presence a quiet anchor. He couldn't fix Robert's pain any more than Robert could erase Max's past. But they could exist in their brokenness together, and somehow, that made both more bearable. "You know what I think?" Robert said one evening. The sky streaked with orange and red. "I think Jean sent you to me. I know that sounds foolish, but I believe it anyway. She always worried about me being alone, always said I needed someone to take care of, to give me purpose." He looked at Max, his eyes damp. "And here you are. A dog who needed someone exactly like me. It's too perfect to be coincidence." Max didn't understand theology or fate or divine intervention, but he understood that whatever force had brought him to Robert's porch luck, timing, Sarah's persistent belief it had been the right force at the right time. Life after rescue wasn't about being saved from something. It was about being welcomed into something. Into routine and rhythm, into companionship that didn't demand but simply offered, into a space where being old and tired and a little broken wasn't a deficit but just part of who you were. As summer deepened and the evenings grew longer, Max settled into the truth of his new existence. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't another trial run where he'd be measured against expectations he couldn't meet. This was home, in the truest sense he'd ever known, and on the porch, in the fading light, with Robert's hand resting on his head and the garden Jean had planted blooming all around them, Max finally let himself believe it. A year passed. Then another. Time, which had once crawled in the shelter, now moved differently, not slowly exactly, but gently, like water flowing around smooth stones. Max measured his days not by kennel routines, but by the quality of light on the porch, the changing seasons in Jean's garden, and the comfortable predictability of life with Robert. He was older now, undeniably so. The gray had spread further across his muzzle and face. His legs were stiffer in the mornings, requiring longer to warm up before walks. His hearing had dulled slightly, and sometimes Robert had to call his name twice before Max noticed. But these changes didn't diminish his value in Robert's eyes. If anything, they created a deeper bond, two beings aging together, understanding each other's limitations without judgment. The porch had become their sacred space. Every evening, without fail, they'd sit together as the sun set. Robert had moved Jean's rocking chair closer to Max's bed, close enough that he could rest his hand on Max's head without stretching, close enough that neither felt alone. "You know what I realized?" Robert said one evening. "The sky painted in shades of lavender and gold. All those years I thought I needed to fill the silence after Jean died. Needed noise, distraction, something to drown out the emptiness. But you taught me different, Max. You taught me that silence can be full, that quiet companionship is its own kind of conversation." Max's tail thumped softly against his bed, a subtle acknowledgement. Robert continued, his voice contemplative. "People always focus on what dogs can do, fetch, guard, perform tricks. But what you do, this being present, this steady existence, it's harder than any trick. You've been returned 3 times because people didn't understand that what you offer is more valuable than energy or entertainment. You offer peace." The words hung in the air, mixing with the sounds of evening crickets beginning their nightly chorus, a distant car passing, wind rustling through the trees that had stood sentinel over this house for decades. "I was bitter when Jean died," Robert admitted, something he'd never quite said aloud before. Angry at the universe, at cancer, at the unfairness of it all. 38 years wasn't enough. I wanted more, deserved more, I thought. He paused, his hand gentle on Max's head. "But then I got you, and you'd been through your own kind of loss homes that didn't keep you, people who didn't see your value. Yet here you are, still willing to trust, still willing to try. If you can be brave enough for that, I figured I could be brave enough to keep living." Margaret had said something similar when she'd stopped by earlier that week. You two saved each other, she'd observed, watching them in the garden. Robert had started to protest, but she'd held up her hand. I'm not being sentimental. I'm being factual. Robert, you were disappearing before Max. And Max, well, Sarah told me he'd almost given up at the shelter. But look at you both now, present, engaged, living. And she was right. Max had learned to recognize happiness, even though it looked different than he'd imagined it might. Happiness wasn't excitement or constant activity. It was this, knowing where you'd sleep tonight and tomorrow night and the night after that. Having someone who greeted you the same way every morning, whose mood was steady, whose expectations were clear and achievable. Being valued not for what you could do, but for what you were. The garden had taught them both about cycles. Things grew, bloomed, faded, returned. John's flowers came back every spring, faithful and beautiful, proof that endings weren't always final. The tomatoes Robert planted produced fruit every summer. The seasons turned in their eternal rotation. And through it all, Max and Robert endured, their own small constant in an ever-changing world. I think about the shelter sometimes, Robert said as the light deepened toward dusk, about all those other dogs still waiting, about the Sarahs and Toms who care for them, believing someone will come. And I think about how close we came to never meeting each other. If I'd come a week earlier or later, if someone else had adopted you first, if I'd been too afraid to try again after Rusty died. He shook his head. All those small moments that had to align just right for us to be sitting here together. Max shifted slightly, resting his chin on Robert's foot, a gesture of trust and affection that had become routine but never lost its meaning. People say you rescued a shelter dog, Robert continued, but we both know that's not the whole truth. You rescued me too. From silence that was too heavy. From a house that echoed with absence. From forgetting that love doesn't end just because one form of it does. He smiled down at Max. Jean would have said we were meant to find each other. That the universe has a way of bringing together the people and dogs who need each other most. The sky had shifted now. Deep purples bleeding into navy blue. Stars were beginning to emerge, faint at first, then brighter as the darkness settled. Robert stood slowly, his joints protesting, and Max rose too, following him inside where dinner waited and the evening routine would unfold as it always did. But before they went in, Robert paused at the door, looking back at the garden, at the street, at the world that had given them both so much pain and eventually this peace. Thank you, Max, he said simply, for waiting long enough to find me, for being patient when everything in you probably wanted to give up, for teaching me that the best things, the most important things, are worth waiting for, even when the wait seems endless. Max looked up at him, his gray muzzle catching the last of the light, his eyes holding all the wisdom of his years. They went inside together, the screen door closing softly behind them, and the porch fell quiet. But it wasn't an empty quiet. It was the quiet of completion, of things finding their right place, of broken pieces fitting together into something whole and beautiful. In shelters across the world, dogs still wait, some in kennels at the back, overlooked and aging, watching younger dogs leave while they stay behind. Some returned multiple times, their confidence worn down, their hope dimmed. Some who've learned that patience is both burden and survival skill. And somewhere, people are living with empty spaces in their homes, in their hearts, in their daily routines. People who think they need youth and energy, who are afraid of loss, who don't yet understand that the deepest connections often come from shared brokenness. Max's story isn't unique, but it's true, and its truth whispers a quiet promise to anyone willing to listen, that being needed matters more than being chosen quickly, that the longest waits can lead to the safest landings, that old dogs and grieving humans and everyone else the world overlooks still have immeasurable value and profound love to offer. On the porch of a modest blue house, in the corner where the light falls golden every evening, a dog bed sits empty now during the day, but come evening, Max will return to it, and Robert will lower himself into his chair beside it, and they will watch another sunset together. Two souls who found each other in the space between hope and despair, proving that some stories end not with fanfare, but with the quiet satisfaction of finally being home. And that, perhaps, is the most important kind of ending there is. If Max's story touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Like and subscribe to follow more rescue stories that remind us all of the power of patience, second chances, and the quiet dignity of those who wait. Every share helps bring attention to senior dogs still waiting in shelters for their own robber to walk through the door. Remember, the best love stories don't always begin with puppies and picket fences. Sometimes they begin with gray muzzles, weathered porches, and two beings brave enough to believe that it's never too late to find home. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And if you're considering adoption, please remember that the dog who's been waiting the longest might just be the one who loves you the deepest.